So recording is on now, and none of the participants will be on the recording. It will be emailed to you within an hour when Philip finishes his session. So, okay, hello and welcome, and thank you very much for joining. Philip?
Hello, and are we waiting for anyone else? Did you say we have more people coming? Should we wait a bit longer, or should we just start?
We are starting on time as always. People may be, may join,
yes,
joining, but I think many people will also be waiting for the recording. So
I see. Okay, so it's sort of at their behest. Well, great. Well, good evening, and I'm Philip. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm an artist and studied art and architecture, and this is the third session. We had a session based on the Ionic column, and we've also done a sculpture and architecture of Ephesus Library in Turkey. So we've had some really fantastic watercolors and drawings coming out in the last month. And so this time we're moving into how all this classical architecture went forward in history and how it was reused in the Renaissance. So I've prepared a new slideshow for you, and we're going to be talking about St. Peter's, obviously hugely popular and most famous building of Christianity, and arguably one of the most important buildings for many people around the world. And we're going to look at the facade of that in particular and how that works as a structure. And I think why I chose that, well, it's because how similar it is to Ephesus Library and what the ideas represent in Ephesus Library in a way recycled and transmutating into something that is still important today. And so, you know, you might walk past classical buildings left, right and center and wonder why we look at those buildings and what they mean to us. So I've just got a sketch I want to show you before I start. This is here what I made earlier, and we've got the sketch of Ephesus Library here, which is kind of what we were looking at last time, and it's a series of 4 columns at the top, or four sets of columns at the top and 4 sets of columns at the bottom. So it actually makes 16 columns that make all these spaces in between, niches for sculpture and windows and doorways to get arranged. And so there are 2 registers, there are 2 sort of levels here. And at the bottom is the small sketch I did of St. Peter's, you know, a 5-minute sort of plan of what we get from that. And of course, the main thing, the door, the entry point is still in the center. Another thing that's really important is you get even and odd numbers playing their role here, because the door has to be exactly in the middle of the building. And then more and more of these, what they call architectural bays, appear later. So, so going from something like that to having a look at a more finished drawing. So I think I can start the slideshow. So let's look at the slideshow here. And we're starting off with a drawing that I made over a period of, say, you know, a couple of days. And it's obviously quite detailed. And you can also see tiny little pictures here of ideas of St. Peter's.
We don't see your screen share. You need to screen.
You don't see my screen share, right? Okay. 1 second. I'm just going to share screen again. That's right. So I'll just start the slideshow one more time. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Sorry about that. So as I said, we looked at the library and the niches and the doorway, and here is a drawing that took a little bit longer to make. And we have kind of small plan and the ideas of the building, and obviously, most importantly, we know the dome, but it's the facade I want to particularly look at, because that's what you see in this enormous square and on top of this staircase that we looked at as well, because the Ephesus Library had a very nice staircase leading to it. Now, the middle part there is called the portico, And in the middle of this triangular pediment at the top, we see the Pope's papal crest. So the mitre of the Pope is represented there. So you look at this building and you think, well, how old is this? Is this Roman? Is this ancient Roman? Is it Baroque? It's all of those things. And so what was there before? So actually this is a holy site of where St. Peter had his chair, if you like. It's not the actual seat or cathedra of the Pope. The Pope has another church called St. John Lateran, which is also designed by architects that were working on St. Peter's about at the same time in the Baroque period, so in the 17th century. So this church has been there since the time of St. Peter and the time of Jesus for 2,000 years. But the church that was there before this, as I'm sure you all know, was a red brick medieval cathedral, and it was falling apart. And so there was actually a couple of popes that were making decisions on whether to demolish it. And in fact, they demolished this thing under this guy called Pope Nicholas V. But then it was Julius II, who's the most famous patron of the arts in the Renaissance, who was commissioning Michelangelo, and is actually more concerned with his own family, because Julius II was the man of the Medici, the Florentine dynasty that ran the art and the commerce of the Florentine Bank. And so by having this Medici Pope in power, what happened was that he completely destroyed the old building and then got Michelangelo to stop working on the Medici tomb. We will see that in the slideshow. And so he then built this building over quite a long period. It was more than 120 years of construction. So it was finished in 1626. And as I say, it's so important because it's not the seat of the Pope, but it's the seat of the first, if you like, representative of Jesus, which was St. Peter. So it's the Church of St. Peter and Paul as well, because Paul was in Rome, but then later went off to preach in other countries. And what we see here are more than two registers. So like in Ephesus, there was this idea of going up. So the Ephesus library really fits into the middle bit under the triangle and maybe say a couple of other doors. But then it's extended out to make way for grand doorways for guards and for the belfry. So the bells are actually in the top edge windows. And then there's this enormous second bit sort of on top of the classical building, which is a load of frames, empty frames, interestingly. So they're not windows, they could be windows, but a lot of the things above this first bit are just framework for imaginable spaces. And then there are also lots and lots of columns that result in statues on top of them. So we were looking at that last time. All that is a sort of platform for then having an enormous dome put on by Michelangelo. But Michelangelo couldn't afford and didn't have the time to design this. So we're actually looking at this name here, which is Carlo Maderno. Now, looking at other buildings of Catholic churches and banks and various state buildings like this, what you often get is pairs of columns, all these classical elements of capitals that we were looking at before, putti, which are these kind of cherub heads, consoles and brackets, dentils. So many elements come into this, but the shapes involved are all coming out of Roman and Greek architecture. So last time I showed you this picture, which is Raphael's painting of this ideal city. So Rome was being reconstructed in the Renaissance, and people like Raphael were planning what would go in, what elements of ancient architecture would matter. So fountains, colosseums, and gateways, and public spaces, large public spaces, something that meant that often, whole streets had to be demolished to make way for the space. So actually, we know St. Peter's as this very long procession, but that whole street was added much later. And so what are these columns and capitals? Well, we looked at the Ionic column The Corinthian column is what develops on from that. And there are lots of these Corinthian columns. And what they are is a set of acanthus leaves that grow up towards more small spiral volutes that are not as big as the ones on the Ionic. So it essentially is the Ionic column, but with more decorative elements added in and more in the round, so something that can go around. So here's a sort of composite drawing I did before at St. Paul's in London. And what we see is registers of acanthus. So acanthus leaves sprouting up. And I mentioned the basket last time. So this idea of a basket full of weeds that grow out and have these opportunities for carvers to show their flair by sort of carving eyelets and undercuts and beautiful shadows with the form that they're working with. And then also having these symbols of life and death and volutes and spirals also incorporated in there. So we looked at this library last time, this structure of the Library of Alexandria as well as the Ephesos. And so this is an archaeologist's idea of what it might have looked like. And why is that important? Well, it's the site of the translation of the Bible. So in Egypt, in Alexandria, in this public library, the Greeks actually got the original texts of the Bible in all these other languages, the Hebrew, Aramaic, and they worked on making a single understandable book. And of course, this book goes back so many centuries, and it was a great task. And so that translation of the Bible in 132 AD is the first translation in a European language. And of course, later at Rome, they translated it into Latin. So of course, that meant that here we have Latin texts running along the sort of architrave at the top of the building in the first register. And what it says is something about a prince, in the honor of Prince and Apostle Paul. So that's, even though it's St. Peter's Church, it's Paul's name that's on the front of the building. And then it says the date of construction there. And also, as you can see in this close-up, what I've done is just colored in some of the niches and doorways that are perforating. And then I've added blue to show where the windows are. So the Pope, who can stand underneath his own heraldry there, can actually stand on the balcony and meet people. And of course, there can be up to 80,000 people in the square. So let's have a look at drawings. Michelangelo and Leonardo and all these people that were great Renaissance minds, they were using geometry, and they're designing things like this, which involve very simple shapes. We're talking about squares and triangles and circles, and how all these buildings really fit in to quite simple things. Plans often being like a basilica. And so St. Petersburg is a basilica. And what that means is it's actually based on the market of Emperor Hadrian in the Roman ruins. It's a Roman building that was used for trade and market function. So it had many entries and many galleries inside. And so here's just an example of a building with simple shapes. It's a church in Venice. It's called the Miracle Church. And as you can see, just there are round domes, circular windows called occhios, round, simple Roman arches, nothing Gothic, nothing pointy. So Michelangelo's designs here you can see his drawings for the dome and the top of the dome there, the pinnacle where people can stand. And there's an internal structure. You can see there are two parts of the dome, so you can walk up staircases inside. So it's a false bottom, if you like. And often domes have to have this because the structure on the outside is not strong enough to hold itself up. So there's a sort of double dome construction going on. And drawings by Michelangelo of decorations and plans. So we can see the cross, the Latin cross, as a main shape for this basilica. And we can see Michelangelo was actually too busy at the time when Julius II said, work on Rome for me now. He was carving these figures and statuesque images of other Medici leaders who had been princes. So he was actually a great sculptor and a great architect. But as you can see under the feet, and if you go to Florence to see this at San Lorenzo Church, it's at the back, and it's great because you can see the feet actually don't get supported here. So it's not finished. You usually get a very short time to see this, but make note of it, because you've got all this amazing sculpture, but the big idea is that the sculptures are forming part of an architectural complex thing that is not finished. So other architects that have taken this on, I mean, this is a palace in Germany, in Potsdam, and you can see the same ideas and elements. Palladio, why I wanted to put him in, we looked at Palladio's buildings before, and this is some buildings in Vicenza, his hometown in North Italy. And you can see these figures are put into the arch and are made use of. You've got these wonderful swags of statues as well. So all this sculpture is incorporated in. And then other emperors, like this Russian Emperor Paul in the 1800s, is building this kind of Palladian building with the same elements involved, and statues and sort of round arms like at Bernini's arms in Rome. So round galleries of columns with statues at each top. And then we're just looking at other decoration. I mean, from Dresden to Venice to Florence, all this complicated Baroque design is everywhere, and it can get quite complex and mathematical. You know, you can get hundreds of statues put in here in St. Petersburg example, where, you know, different size statues and asymmetrical Rococo designs get absolutely impossible to follow. So, you know, cities like Venice here, lots and lots of Baroque style. And what is Baroque? Well, it comes from the idea actually of this, which is a shell, if you can see in my screen. It's a misshapen sort of pearl shell, or it's a misshapen pearl itself that might have been fished in India and brought into Europe. And so this oriental trade and these misshapen forms that are sort of shimmering and beautiful and hourglass. And so all these buildings, they're using Baroque shapes, and that's a real opportunity for artists to put together sculpture and architecture and painting and everything else into one grand ensemble, into an impression. So here we got Palladio doing it much in the same way like at Rome. So Leonardo planning churches in Italy, and then Michelangelo. So you can see his architectural style here. You've got a column in the bottom corner here, and you've also got bits of doorways, which is what we're going to look at, and how meticulous he'd been. And so he starts off with, you know, you wouldn't believe it, but this is a Michelangelo sketch here. But on the right, this is Michelangelo doing a very specific architectural drawing. So Michelangelo really putting everything together and then teaching people like Moderno at Rome to work on these designs. And, you know, here's another example. This is the church of Lateran, St. John Lateran, and another church. All these churches by Moderno, Santa Vittoria. This is a great place to visit because you can see Bernini's sculpture, which is so famous inside this St. Vittoria. It's the Ecstasy of St. Therese. It's one of the most expressive religious sculptures with amazing fabrics and amazing stone carving to the highest sort of detail. So going back to the building, well, we've got all these buildings in Rome, and we've got the church obviously having been studied by so many architects, and you can see how they look at the way light falls there, and they look at the kind of idea of this flat wall with, like at St. John Lateran here, empty niches or filled niches of darker spaces kind of perforating through. And look, this is another church that looks exactly the same. And I just wanted to show you this one in St. Petersburg. So here's the grand sort of approach to Rome. And then this is America. They're doing it in America. And then this particular church I wanted to mention, Our Lady of Peace in Côte d'Ivoire. So this is at Yamoussoukro, administrative capital of Ivory Coast. And look what they've done. They've built a larger St. Peter's. But here they've removed the very thing that we're going to draw, which is the facade. So here they just opted for the dome and the colonnade. So this is one of the biggest churches in Africa, and so important for so many Catholics and other Christians in Africa, and obviously at an enormous cost. Oh, and what's interesting is they've compared here in the middle. I've got half of it, the scale with Rome. So let's just go and look at St. Peter's, back to St. Peter's, and St. Paul's, and all these buildings that are resonating, and people are obviously drawing this. Some of my students, people travel to Rome to draw these pictures for hundreds of years on their grand tour. They're looking at all these ancient classical buildings like this in Ephesus, and then they're looking at the Latin and the Roman columns on a church that's still functional today. So I hope that was interesting. I hope we can get on with the drawing, the practical side now. So I've got these reference images that we looked at, and I think it would be good to just flip to the camera. So I'm just going to go to this stop screen share, and then I'm going to try and switch on the camera. So yeah, perfect. Thanks very much. Okay, so we're on the page here. Hope we're all on the same page. And as I was showing before, one of the things to do is just to make sure you've got a sharp pencil tip, so that we can see well what we're doing, especially with architectural drawing like this. So I've got a ruler. I don't know if you want to use a ruler or a straight edge, that might help in this, because this is quite a complex thing. So one of the things I want to do, as usual now, it seems, is to draw a kind of bottom line, if you like, just to have something to play up against on the pitch. So we're just going to draw a line. It's about, let's see, on my scale, it's about 25 centimeters long. And I'm just going to try and find the middle, and also put up a vertical line, because I think, again, we're going to need a middle line really up here. So we're just going to try and attempt to get as much done as we can with that. And obviously we want to have, as I say, a little bit of, about a centimetre higher, we want to have another line, just so that we can have the stairs. And so we've got several things to consider here. Obviously, the facade is going to take up the major part of the picture. And then we're going to have some space at the top for the dome. So we're going to measure a little bit what the geometry is here. And as I was saying, there was lots of simple ideas like squares and triangles and circles. So I think the first thing to do is just to work up to the register, which is where the triangular pediment is. So let's put in another line about 10 centimeters above. So we know that that's where the triangle will be, and just put in a 3 centimeter triangular pediment, if you like this kind of long diagonal line. So then we've got that simple shape that we started with, and also we've got a square. If we try and just draw in this first square, that's where quite a few of the columns will fit in, but they're going to be actually fitting in to something slightly wider, so we can put in a column just outside the square, so that is, if you like, the simple shape we start with, and then another square will have to go in at the edges of this. Okay, so we've got 3 squares, and the easy way to find the middle of a square, as we looked at before, is just to cross the corners. So before we draw any detail, we're just going to look at the really major ideas here. So where is the middle of these 3 squares? Okay, so 3 squares and a triangle on top. And then, of course, we were talking about Fibonacci and all these proportions of the spiral, and how buildings like the Parthenon and all this have all these different sizes of diminishing scale. It's quite interesting that the proportions that we have in the next level, before we do anything with the columns, is a much smaller set of squares, and probably I would say there's quite a few of them, you know, something like 10 little squares that are just bigger than the pediment. So this golden section proportion that we were talking about, which is A to B equals B to C, which means a smaller part like this is as small to this in relationship to this bigger part as this bigger part is to the whole. So here we can find that proportion just by eye, by looking at 3 sections where one is slightly more than half and the other is slightly less than half. So, I mean, we're not going to get into too much maths here like the architects would, but we know that we can create squares like regardless of this pediment just behind. So here are some smaller squares. So let's see how many squares we can fit. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So interestingly, we've got 8 squares sat on top of 3 squares. So an odd number on top of underneath an even number. So that gives us the entrance, that doorway in the middle, but then it equally divides each half into 4. So that's really, really crucial, I think, for understanding this design by Maderno. And then somewhere in the middle of these outer squares, if we just draw some vertical sketchy lines, we can see that that is where the staircase will actually begin. So this is a much wider staircase than, say, at a Greek temple, because they want as many people to come up. And that's why they've had to actually allow for more than one door. And we're looking at 5 doors on top of the staircase. So it's going to be a process to find all these things. I think the first thing to do is to find maybe the outer, start from outside in. So if we're looking out here into this square, we've got sort of it being halved in the staircase. And then just outside that is a doorway. So if we just divide that space in half by just putting in a line, we know that there's going to be an arched doorway. And how far up is it going to go? Because we've got actually a set of doorways and arches that fit into a certain part. And then we've got some windows that go all the way across. So there's going to be a line about 1 centimeter beneath the triangular pediment, and that's going to be the architrave. So we've got a flat area where we can have this text, and we can have several sort of little lines underneath it just to underline that. So 1, 2, so we're going to have this as the architrave. And then in the middle of the square, we've got this sort of other line. So this big square, and the middle of it, we can just draw a line across. And that's going to be where balconies on the second floor sit. So back out on the edge, we've got a little window, and we can just draw an arch like this and put it sitting on a balcony like this. Really, really simple idea. And the same on the other side. We're going to just divide this in half again, so we know where the center is between the middle and the edge of the building, and then just sit a little balcony and a little arched window there. And beneath that, pretty much almost immediately, is a keystone, a little keystone of the arch, and an arch that's a little bit wide. I mean, it's probably, you know, a couple of centimeters wide, and that goes right down to the floor beneath the staircase. Okay, so let's have a look on the other side. Same again. I mean, Baroque is particularly symmetrical. I mean, you're going to always get a set of really symmetrical things happening, and very rarely you're going to get asymmetry. So that kind of works psychologically. It's quite interesting, because when you see a building that's lopsided, or a Bauhaus building or something like that, you're looking at so many different bits of information and individual things. Whereas here, and also I'd say that about an old cathedral, like what was there before, was so much information done over so many centuries. And so we're just doubling up the arch here to have these side entrances. This is where the Swiss guards stand. They're all in uniforms, and the idea is just to overwhelm us with symmetry, something quite inhuman almost, something from a pagan world. And then we also have other windows. So of course, the most important balcony is in the middle. So if we look here, we're going to just draw a nice little balcony about the same length, you know, about 2 centimeters or so, a bit less than 2 centimeters, and have an arched window just sitting there parallel to the others on the edge. So that's where the Pope can come out and say hello. And obviously on top of that is a little pediment, and this is just a half moon, like a sort of slice of an orange slice, you know, something like a hat. And you can see all these forms are very, very much like the sun setting, or all these beautiful forms of classical architecture. Nothing too sharp. I mean, you know, the sharpest thing you get here is the pinnacle or this pediment. So here we can also draw in a frame for that pediment, an architrave that goes up. And, you know, that's obviously a sharp end. So that's in the middle of the building, but most of the building is just spaces and arches, and nothing aggressive at all. We can even put in this little space for the mitre to go in this little frame. So Julius II can have his mark stamped in the middle of the building with the keys of St. Peter's. So that's the symbol. Okay, so now we've got the columns to deal with. There are 4 evenly spaced columns. So the capitals are going to be about the same size. So getting a line down for one column just either side of this, so sketching that in, and having space for the capitals, the Corinthian Roman capitals. So something incredibly classical and alternating with the pediments. So let's just project down a couple of columns. There's obviously a lot of columns to deal with, and you know, Moderno didn't want us to look at those columns as anything different one from another. They're like a set of trees. So got 2 columns, and then sort of 2 more. And as I said, one was just outside the pediment. So under the pediment, there's another column. So there's two sets of columns on the edges of this inner portico that are actually much more closely put together. So that's something different. So rather than having too many columns of different sizes, which he also has, but like more importantly, we're looking at a different rhythm here on the edge of the entrance. So that makes for kind of the clear spacing of where people are going to, it sets out where people are going to go into the building. So two columns and two columns, and they probably chamfer in just a little bit. They get slightly thinner towards the top, and then they have caps on them, which are Corinthian. So that's 6 columns, and then there's a space for other doorways. So next we've got a space about the same width across, so we can take that measurement, just put that measurement across, and the same here, and put in a column again, and these columns again will frame extra entrance doorways, and those will be for the crowds to come into the church. So obviously putting in the capitals there. So here we go. Spaces for more doors and windows. Let's see. In between here, we've got some more balconies. So just, I'm trying to do an organic rhythm here. So we're not going to jump all over the place. So working sort of from the middle out. But obviously, once you're planning things like this, you can actually just draw any part in a Baroque building at any order. And I think as you peruse the building as well, that's important, because you can look over there and there might be, the Pope, there might be another priest next to him, or there might be a political person or someone else appearing in different windows and balconies when there is this special time when people can see these representatives of the church. So above these little windows, again, little hats, but slightly squashed in, because the side ones, the ones on the flank, are less grandiose than the Pope's one. And again, smaller columns in amongst bigger columns will feature. So we have little columns supporting these little pediments, with tiny little Corinthian capitals as well. So that's sort of microcosms of this bigger idea for the building are within these framed balconied spaces. And also there's another set of pictures we have to think of, which is a sort of subdivision here. So if we just put in another little guideline and give ourselves a little set of square spaces, there's actually some sculpture relief in framed spaces under the balcony illustrating something there. And then under these balconies, there are these kind of funny little horizontal windows. And you might ask, well, what those might be for. They're empty, they're actually perforating the surface. And so like if we actually think about that, they'll continue across to here and to here. And they actually allow for sound from the belfry, because in these windows at the side will be the bells. And then, so we've got spaces for the bells above this as well. So bells will be also on the next register. So we're just going to put some bells in just to remember them. But also, I'd like to sort of think, what are these framed spaces for? Well, they also represent these places where people in a palace might have servants, and they usually would be higher up. So this would be sort of spaces that are not as grand. They might be spaces where a choir could assemble. So it's something to do with the acoustic function of the building. So this not just being a sculptural thing, but it might be a musical instrument, if you like. And then the entrances themselves, well, there's going to be 2 smaller columns on the main entrance, just underneath, and they will be supported by little ionic columns like this. So we can just sketch in the volutes of the ionic columns and then sort of have a little framework for them to sit in. And so the actual doorway is an empty space. Isn't that interesting? Like, you know, you might have expected a large arched door, but actually they're like a Roman building. They're just big bits of wood that could hinge in and close that whole space. So that's the main entrance. And then next to that is something a lot more elegant. There's actually a couple of, again, framed bas relief sculptures in these sort of secondary little frames. And under that is space for tiny little columns to support an arch. So, I mean, this is obviously subdividing all this stuff into even more complicated ideas. And the arch is a Roman form. So again, Roman elegant doors, maybe for ladies or for other people, but not for the main entrance, but just by the main entrance, these other doors. And of course, it might mean that, you know, men on one side and women on the other. So I'm just shading in these doorways as I go along. That can often help. And then obviously there is again this repetition of these little columns inside the big columns, and you know, slightly smaller width, but the same sort of idea that you know, a big Roman gap serves as another entrance. So maybe for lots of groups of school children or other people to go in. So again, on the other side, just shading in this space here. So we've got a series of 5 entrances on the staircase. And then we've got another little bit of space. So here, what Moderno has done is to create some flat columns. So all these columns along here were round, and then suddenly you're just faced with doubled up flat relief columns. So a sort of illusion of a column rather than the column itself. And that's where Baroque architecture can just catch you off guard. So you think you know what you're looking at, but if you look closer, you're actually looking at a sculpture of a column. And it's actually doubled up. So you've got double capitals overlapping each other. So that leads into this dynamic space here, and it creates a kind of frame. But then, of course, there's the exterior, the entrances on the side, and they're also flat. So essentially, the portico is framed within these just flat columns. So I'm just showing you there, and I'm also looking on the other end, and I'm just going to draw a column up there, a flat column that will actually go to the very bottom of the building and have a very fat pedestal, but essentially it's not a column, it's a frame that looks like a column. Okay, so that's sort of beginning to take shape, and I think if you want to make it easier, you can shade in this space as well, just to have that ready for when we color in, just to know where we can splash a bit of darker color in. So those grand guards entrances are no longer designed as doorways into the church. On the outside, they're actually not open to the public. They're driveways for the army for the Swiss Guards. And of course, you know, the Vatican is a separate state. It's got its own army and it's got its own kind of legislature. So that is actually a hornet's nest on either side of the building. And again, there are going to be some spaces. So here on the sides are some more half moon shapes, just in line with the empty doorways. And in those half moon shapes are little arched niches. So what is a niche? It's a space where you can imagine a sculpture. So it's a frame with a sort of concave space that doesn't particularly do anything other than leave space for the mind to project maybe, you know, your dead relatives, or you know, somebody you've lost, or it might be a statue was put there at one point and then removed. So, you know, it might be different things, like candles can be put there at different times of year for different festivities. So it's a dynamic thing, because it means this is a kind of theatrical stage. And as I was saying before, so I'm just putting in some more frames above, these buildings are looking at Greek theatres and Roman theatres. So it was emperors like Hadrian and Roman emperors who built buildings like this to entertain people in the amphitheatre, to have actors appear. So even though here it's for the Pope and the priests, it actually could be a Roman pagan space in a way. So that's why there are so many elements of the Roman and Greek theatre just popping up in the building. Okay, so now here, more balconies. So there's just never enough subdivisions, tiny little columns, and we're just lining up another half moon. But this half moon actually is triangular. So this is what's called a broken pediment, or a pediment that seems like a triangular one, but it's just cut off. So that's sort of starts thinking of itself as a half moon, but actually is a broken pediment. So this symbol of the fall of Rome. And so this is why this is coming in here as another balcony, seeming like the same thing. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be a set of sort of broken pediments. So there's actually pairs of these on the edge. And again, arched windows and arched spaces. Some of them are windows, some of them are spaces, but all of them have this illusion of being a balcony on this level, because that's the function of them. They're spaces for people to come out and be framed in an arch and columns with a pediment. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows, and then some extra sort of empty non-windows there. And then here where we did the sort of edge, there's another repetition of this wide half moon. So a wide half moon really is just there for us to get back to the beginning, the middle. And so as we look at the building, we're seeing the same patterns reoccur. So we're just sort of drawing them in as a set of smaller columns within bigger columns. So that's our thing. And then there are some interesting things going on here in this level, because under the triangle, there is what would be called an architrave. And obviously that's framed nicely. We've got this, maybe another line across for an extra sort of frame. But then we've got this space for Roman lettering. Now, I just want to mention that the Roman lettering is designed exactly according to the designs found on the Trajan column. So there's a whole science of how to draw these letters. The point being that the spacing and all these things are designed very, very accurately. I mean, you know, we're not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to say that you could do a whole lesson on how to do Roman lettering, or actually a whole course. You know, where I used to study, there was a whole course on Roman lettering, And, you know, the presence of Latin, and obviously then using those Roman letters to paint, you know, tell stories in English and other things. That's a whole set of information we might come back to. But let's just look at this top part of the building. The columns have finished with their sort of capitals. And, you know, if we look into these capitals, they're composed of these little voluted squiggly bits at the top and then rows of leaves. So, I mean, we can't spend too long on this in the drawing yet, but I think what we can do is just suggest at the top of these things that small things are going on within them. And then the columns turn into, they jump a step and they turn into really something smaller than columns. They turn into flat things, a bit like these outer flat things here. And so we can just take a straight edge really and use that to go across the building. So just on the edge of each column, we can go and draw straight edges and put in some more columns lined up with the columns. But these are not columns, they're flat. So just going across the building with a ruler and just putting in these things just above the edge of each column, and you know, that makes it a lot easier with the ruler really. But I'm just going to get a shorter ruler. I'm just going to continue going across and marking in spaces for what will support statues. So all the way across, we're going to get as many supports for statues as there are columns. And then also we can just rule off at the top and have a straight rule across for the top of this. Okay, so we've got a nice finishing thing. Excuse me for the splodges, just correct that. Okay, so we've got a nice thing happening because up here, there are actually some nice little window frames or niche frames just overlapped by the pediment. And that suggests that it's sort of like a building behind another building. So all this overlapping leads the eye in. We're really kind of feeling like there's going to be a lot of echoing sound here. So we skip this space in between, and then we're looking at more frames. It's almost like picture frames or window frames, but they're not actually there. They're just, there's nothing in them. They're kind of horizontal shapes like this. And then there's square shapes. So there's a different rhythm in each space, really. And so for the place where the bells are ringing, they're going to be very, very big frames with a sort of series of frames within frames, and some consoles and decorations there. So that all of these things that we saw with Michelangelo's drawings of these really elaborate Renaissance things happening here, really. That's happening equally the same on the other side. So here, sort of sets of lines, frames, and square frames for as much sound to travel out as possible, and this kind of prison-like grille. So spaces that are framed to have the sound. And then also on top of that, we're going to see the appearance of a clock face. So time was also going to be told on a circular clock face, either side of the building. So, you know, Moderno is really not only made a theatre, not only made a musical instrument, not only is it a load of sculpture niches and sculptures on the building, it's also got this function of retelling the same time twice. So you know the symmetry there, and this is where on the top level we're going to have lots of sculpture. But just before we get there, I suggest just to finish what we did on this side over there, and to have a square frame in the space between these columns. So a nice square reminding us of the origin of all these shapes here, and then another rectangle sort of frame happening there in between the other columns with a broken pediment representing the fall of ancient Rome, and then sort of Sansovino style patterns, you know, these Venetian elaborate frame patterns on the corners and ornaments, things happening that really kind of catch the eye, but just enough for us to sort of stop there, but then to travel up to the next register, which is the balustrade. So in between the clocks, just a little line above, we've got this little fence, and each of the columns ends on the fence, and those are sort of stopping points for statues to stand up on them. So this gets more and more detailed because, you know, you can subdivide all these spaces, and you've got little figures of saints happening either end. So here by the clock, I'm going to have some figures. I'm not going to go into too much detail. They might have crosses or they might have things that they hold, but really they're figures that are just majestically standing on top of the colonnade, and that's continued in the Bernini arms of the building. So there are hundreds of statues, and of course they're not meant to be seen from nearby. So they're just meant to be seen as figures from a long way away. And that means really that, you know, you might recognize some of them as angels, Gabriel, or saints, but really it's a collection of all sorts of characters in the story. And you can see that some of them are dressed like emperors. They've got, you know, fabric running down them. They've got gestures that are very expressive, and their body language is kind of arms open or pulling something up or doing something heroic. So all of that kind of language in the Baroque sculpture is actually what happened in Roman sculpture, and they've just borrowed it and remade it. So here we have the facade planned out. So I'm sorry about the sort of wet marks on my drawing, but I just want to sketch in the dome. We're not going to have too much of the dome because it's sort of way beyond this. So this egg shape, just wanted to mention how interesting this, in Florence, the egg shape of the dome is the most famous and largest egg-shaped dome. And we saw Michelangelo's drawings in the slideshow. And it's divided into these sort of ribs. And it's also got an internal dome. So it's something that is a very interesting and strong structure. And Brunelleschi, the guy that made the first one in Florence that Michelangelo was looking at, got an egg and smashed the end of it to prove that the egg could hold itself up, because the Medici that commissioned this didn't believe him, and they actually didn't finish building it until Brunelleschi was dead. So this idea of a structure that's oval like an egg with a supporting little gallery at the top is just Michelangelo copying and pasting Brunelleschi really right into Rome. And that statement really is also very powerful because that shows the Medici, the Pope Medici, the Medici Bank, as the people that are quoting themselves at Rome. So there's a series of little columns up there and a gallery for people to stand on, and the same in Florence. And you walk through this enormous building and you can see little windows in two registers going along. So as you walk up these giant staircases in there, you actually experience being inside an enormous, almost organic oval structure. And that feeling of being inside an egg and inside the epicenter of action is very powerful. And of course, then the powerful thing of standing on top and seeing the whole of Rome at your sort of behest, you suddenly get into a godlike position above the whole of the city. And of course, that's got very powerful energy to it as a form. And I've just put in a set of windows. I haven't really drawn too much. I might put some hats above them just as little dashes, because they also have broken pediments, because Michelangelo really wanted to go to town with these Roman symbols. And then also there's going to be columns, but they're just overlapped by the statues. So just sketching verticals in, just to have that rhythm, and also a large frame. So the windows beneath there, we're going to maybe sketch something in, but really it's not so important. What's important is to have a sense of something big and oval beyond the center and slightly off center, if you like. I've just taken the liberty of having half of it off, a little bit bigger on one side than on the other, because it's so big that all this rhythm and structure in the first part is just subservient to another larger structure beyond. Okay, and finishing off, I'd like to just finish the drawing part by having a few steps drawn in, just some lines horizontally at the bottom, just drawing those in to remind us of this ascension, this sense of going up into the building, into the piano nobile and all this stuff. And also just not forgetting the columns. From the Corinthian, we've gone into something composite, which is a swag of fruit running and hanging off each of the tops of these pilasters, these little things that are holding up the statues. So something hanging off is a very interesting idea, because it's horns of plenty, the cornucopiae, the swags of fruit, and that repeats again and again, and it's just another detail that reminds us of just how heavy all this stone is. And of course, having stone swags and stone fruit and all this is sort of verisimilitude, or it's sort of trompe l'oeil, you're making people think that they're in front of a big marketplace. And of course, don't forget the Basilica, the idea of the Roman market that this building actually comes from. So swags of fruit on top of those pilasters, and then there might be extra lines there, but I think that kind of gives us that structure. And I think we've got time now to think about how to make this an attractive drawing. I mean, the colored one in that I showed you before, I actually spent much more time drawing all the details and didn't really think too much about it. But I think what's really nice in the reference image is the sky. So we can just take some watercolors and set up to do some painting. So I think one of the colors I suggest that we take is obviously white. It's not a color, it's a white mixing paste, and I'm just going to put some white down on a mixing palette and just have that available to me. So hopefully you're catching up with the drawing part. And then in the meantime, I'm just going to take a simple flat brush that's going to look like this. So it's a flat watercolor brush. And I'm just going to actually wet the paper with a bit of blue. Just going to sort of go around all of these, clocks. So little framework around the clocks and some little angels there also added in. Yeah, so colouring in the sky with water mainly, just to have wet paper. It's quite good, because then what we're going to do next is create atmospheric clouds. So I'm going to just have a bit more blue. So I'll take a sort of turquoise blue and try that, and just stipple on blue into the sky. And you can spend a long time doing skies and things like that. I think with watercolor and just quick painting, it's nice to have spontaneity and a sort of lightness of touch. So if you actually, it's the difference between trying to draw a line for ages like this, or just doing a line in one move. And the line one move in drawing can often be more effective. Even though it might be wrong, it looks more confident. So I'm just saying, like, dapple on some blues and then have them sort of half drying there. And then we're going to get this white and just pick it up. It's quite thick. And, you can either use the white of the paper, or you can, as I said, the paper already contains white in it as a pigment that was mixed with the paper pulp. So you're kind of pushing and pulling here by stippling on lots and lots of white, and just looking at shapes that clouds might make. We want a kind of lightness, some sort of woolly side to side movement, and breaking up those blues with white that's going to partly mix with what's on the surface, which is bits of blue, and at the same time it might just be thicker in some places. So here is a very quick sort of sky that really we can work into, and it's sort of half wet as well, which is good, because you might want to take a smaller brush once you've got this, and just, even with water, just scribble over and break up some of these thick bits of paint, and just occasionally have the odd line appearing, because that sort of suggests that this is a feathery nebulous sky that is actually alive and moving all the time, and it needs to feel like the way water would dry on a surface, a kind of marbling feeling of something in motion, because that's going to be so contrasting with what we have coming up, which is the building itself. So I'm just going to take the small brush, and in a couple of spots with the tip of the smaller brush, just draw in a bit more blue in amongst the clouds to the edge, just to have that on the reference image. And obviously on the other reference image that you got in the mail, there's actually an even bigger cloud. So if you want to do that, you can kind of have gaps that you draw in among the clouds. And this is really kind of poetry, because you could have gaps in between clouds with blue, and then you can also have darker, you can mix blue and black and create a sort of midnight blue on the edge of clouds and even within clouds. So just to get a bit more drama in this picture, we can play with clouds and add just little bits of black in. And it's amazing how quickly they get volume from that. So just towards the edge of the dome, I'll just get more blue and bring that, just circle that dome form, that egg-shaped form, and just have sky going right to the roof of this building, the roof that you can walk across in between the statues, and just sketch in some sky colors, because we want this building to really take off. So if we just use overlapping, some places can be a line that then you just sort of work over. So getting a bit more of a dramatic sky. You know, you could even go further. You could even have a moon or a light reflecting there. You know, you could take the white and take a little bit of yellow and mix those up. And with water, you can just splash a little bit of yellow light into the clouds. So that would make for, you know, the beginning of something like a storm happening. You know, you can just use a tiny hint of yellow and a bit more gray. I mean, I can actually get a ready mixed gray like this, or just mix up black and white and just suggest a little bit of gray happening in the clouds as well. Not too much, because we don't want to detract from the building, but I think if it just breaks up that whiteness, it's nice, because it can make that as a nice sort of neutral color that isn't black or white, it isn't too bright, and gray, you know, it sort of resonates well also with the building, because it's a stone building. But of course, it depends on the lighting, very much so, and often painters are actually waiting for that moment in the magic hour when the sunlight will change the color of the building. So we've got an idea of some yellow light. We could do that with the building, and in the photograph it's a little yellow. So what can we do? We can take this smaller brush and mix a little bit of yellow with a little bit of gray and white, and just have on our palette something a bit yellow gray, a bit muddy, and just use that in between the columns, especially for shadow. So there's obviously going to be spaces that are darker, so we can just look in between the columns. Like this space here between the columns is not as protruding as the columns, and just fill that in. And then also under the kind of architrave where the text is, in between and inside the pediments, we can also just put bits of gray, because that will take those shapes and make them more dynamic, just take them back a bit. So gray in between the capitals and the pediments, and that makes a kind of shelf where light can't arrive underneath. And also in the next level, in these spaces like this, we can darken them with gray. So that's another step back in space and in these framed spaces. So where have we got some really nice places to put gray on? Well, all of the shaded in stuff, all of this, the doorways, the little places where we used the pencil before, we can actually, with water on the brush and a little bit of gray, activate the carbon of the, activate the sort of charcoal or the graphite in the pencils, and use that to mix up with the wet medium, and then have dark spaces forming for the entrances with gray, and that gray will look darker because of the black of the pencil underneath. Okay, so here we go. Here are some gray arch spaces, and pretty interesting, because that then row of gray smaller frames as well, it works a little bit like a set of sort of speakers, if you like. And then behind the pediment as well, we're just looking at any spaces that we can darken with the shadows and give this building a little bit of life. And some of them might be open later, but like this side, this arch here, it could be later, like in the reference image, the doors could be open. So, if you want the building to look asymmetrical, you could lighten that area up and have, say, half a door open or something, suggesting a space behind the building's facade. But, that's sort of, I leave that open. I'm going to just continue with shadow. So inside this triangular pediment, a bit of shadow on the underside of these frames, on the outside of the frames, and on the statues as well. We want just under the heads a little shadow. I mean, this is a bit like how Canaletto would have done it. He would have just had tiny little marks of light and dark next to each other as enough information to suggest shadow and light on these very big and complicated forms from a distance. So by doing that, by just putting shadow there and then sketching light in with the white, so on their garments like that, and then on their heads, a white dot might work. Little blob of white paint might just be enough to suggest that they have heads and that those are supported and they're heavy. So white there. And then another thing I'd say would be good is just to bring the columns forward. So by putting white on the columns, by just sketching that in, that will suddenly bring the building out into two sort of sets of surfaces. And as we were saying, some of these columns were round and others are flat. So if we just start with the 4 columns, well, actually the 6 in the middle, and have those running up and down like that with white against the grey shadow, that begins to take hold. And then these, again, on the other side, brighter. I mean, the white will naturally mix with anything there, so it always goes a bit off white. And you can spend time, enjoying kind of the tonal variation on that. But basically, I'm just lightening up the row of major vertical columns. And also with the tip of the brush, you can just sketch in little columns as well, because they're going to be a little thing, a little feature. Now, inside the big arches, there's actually some capitals and columns sandwiched in there, and then the arches are sitting on top of that with the keystone. So that's something interesting, because the surprising thing about Maderno is that he wants to always to find more and more information as you look across the building. So he wants to have hidden columns and things overlapping each other on pretty much every level. And then the Corinthian capitals. Well, again, like, we haven't got time to sketch hundreds of details, but if we just take the tip of the brush and just put in some grey dots on there to represent the leaves on underneath the volutes, that can be quite effective. And the grey is a middle ground, so not too much information, but just enough to suggest, like with the statues, that there are bits that poke out and catch the light and undercuts that just don't. So obviously then we've got quite a lot of drama happening of light and shadow just by putting these, just marking in underlying lines. And also we've got a set of little spaces in between here, and so on these edges of columns or half columns, whatever you call them, that are above, and they're kind of grotesques and continuations of the perfect columns. I'm just sketching in light grey wet lines just to make sure that we know that these are the places where shadows might form as well. Now kind of a little bit of colour. We can take a larger brush and something like this and just wet the brush and take a kind of Naples yellow, which is a colour that is very nice because originally it was based on lead, but the point being that this Naples yellow, which is the one here, is a yellow that's neutral. It's not too loud, and it's a kind of off-white or a beige, if you like. So taking that colour and just transparently, just testing it out on the page, but just transparently we can put that on top of things and try and keep the brush, you know, clean, just by having kind of wet and quick application, just by disrupting all of this with a bit of Naples yellow. And if you think that's messy, well, you can get a smaller brush and just use the smaller brush, a bit more opaque as well, and just fill in between spaces. So we're just trying to get some yellow light on there. But if it's transparent, that's nice because that lets some of the paper do the work and lets some of the paper kind of resonate behind the glaze of transparent color. So wet brush and just apply this Naples yellow in the white spaces in between. On the lower registers, again, not maybe on the columns, but in between, on the balconies, you know, just get some yellow down into this sort of tonally more neutral areas that are not too bright and not too dark. So, you know, you can spend an awfully long time coloring in every shape and detail. But I think if it's a wet brush, you can kind of cross spaces and work across the whole building and just sort of have a beige, maybe around the clocks on the statues. You can put that in. And a light sky blue as well is another color that I think is important here. So this kind of white blue, something much brighter than what's on the sky, you know, but something that we can use to reflect the sky, because, you know, these windows are there, which again just give a different dynamic to this building because the glass reflecting the space outside it is really, really effective. And also on the dome, we can just get water and a little bit of this sky blue and create a base coat for the dome's lead covered roof. All right, and then just with a bit of white, we can work white in there just to create an effective thing with maybe just a tiny suggestion of some dots on the dome, and just having a bit of stonework in amongst a sky blue tone there. It's quite nice. Well, that's sort of the basic idea. And then once we've got that idea, you know, you can spend hours drawing in the lettering, drawing in any highlights that you think need to be brought forward. You know, you might play around with this and just kind of playfully see what you think might stand out more. You know, if you want to make a point of some of these details, you can also put light on the stairs. So again, white on the steps, slightly transparent, will reveal the pencil lines beneath, and that will suggest a stairs. But you might even get a little bit of yellow light on the stairs, just hinting at the idea that maybe the sun is also reflecting off this diagonal surface that's facing towards. And then, so we could be put in the picture as a crowd. So if you want to animate this space, you can just take a brush and put in lots and lots of people. I mean, as I said, it can fit up to 80,000. And I'm just taking a bigger brush with gray and just blocking in tone under the building. And I can actually put in some nice, you know, populous people in as different colors. If I want, you know, dark greens, dark blues, populate the square with people, like in the reference image. You know, you can always put in a couple of red dots, a few different colored kind of effects. So that can just animate this space. And often this is what architects do, is they fill the space with lots and lots of tiny little people, just to show the scale of the building. And of course, this is an enormous building, rising up something like the height of a normal church to its facade, and then with a giant dome above it. So this is really just to give us a sense of how big this is, that people can walk up the stairs and be tiny little ants coming into these giant doors. And of course, there could be, you know, a couple of Swiss guards for fun. You know, you could put some blue and yellow marks in there to suggest that above all these people are some blue and yellow. So just put some yellow dots down and some blue stripes, just to suggest that the whole place is guarded as well. I think, I mean, you know, you can play with shadow. You can put shadow, like we were doing with Ephesus as well, on the window frames, on the arches. You can sketch in windows like that. You know, you can animate the building for hours. So hopefully those of you who are watching the recorded version of this later, you know, don't do this in exactly the amount of time that I've got, but, you know, enjoy continuing in and painting in detail. Just using the tip of the brush, you can get as much detail as you so like, just by having tiny little dots of light and dark and gray next to each other. And that means you can also put shadows on the columns. You know, you could have shadows running down the columns like this. And, you know, you can really enjoy doing this building and making it more and more complicated if you like. But if you want just the general idea of the building, I think that gives us that general idea, and it sort of introduces us to that classical sculpture or Baroque and classical elements that we see here. And obviously different times of day will form different light and shadow on there. And if you want it to be a sunset, you know, you can always splash a bit of yellow over there, or work in Naples yellow more and more. And look at where, you know, you've got balustrades and balconies and things where you can create sequences and rhythms and just have, you know, lots of things happening. Even every balcony could be some balustrades and some bits of column catching the light. So I kind of leave it open to you to work in as much as you think you want to on this and enjoy it, really. So thank you very much. And I think that's been a very busy lesson, but hopefully that gives you the framework and plan to to create something like this.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Now, looking through the chat. Oh, sorry, missed the message from Vanessa. Could we use gouache for the weight? Yep, that was a yes.
Yes,
Rihanna,
definitely.
thank
I'll just say about gouache. A lot of people get confused. What gouache is actually watercolor medium, which is a gum arabic mixed with the pigment. So if you're making oils or watercolors, you're mixing the pigment with a medium, which is a glue in water or in oil. So in watercolor and gouache, it's the same medium. It's a water resoluble, reusable medium. So gouache is coming usually in a tube, and it's to keep the air out, but it can be thinned right down to the same consistency as watercolor. So yes, I'm using gouache, acrylic, anything that's water soluble. And if you use acrylic, you know it dries and it becomes a plastic layer. So then it doesn't, you can't re-wet it. But gouache can be reactivated once it's dried on the surface. So I just say, if you use gouache, know that once you've got it dried on the painting, if you start glazing over it, it will mix with the glazes over the top.
Excellent. I will now need to ask if there are any more questions that you would like to ask Philip. Oh, we have Luis says that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And Vanessa says excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for staying with us, and I'm really looking forward to any paintings and drawings that come out of this, and as rough and sketchy as possible as well. I'm not looking for, you know, hundreds of finished perfect paintings here. I think I'm really excited to see different ages and different people interpreting what I say and working on these buildings in a different way. I mean, last time it was amazing to see such different renditions and so much enthusiasm. So please post all your work and you know, promote the idea, because from here on in, I think the next lecture, I would like to suggest something a bit different. We might work into Gothic architecture and see how that continued on from classical. There's so many buildings in London that combine all those elements of classical and Gothic. So I'm going to think of a good building to take, and it might be the next lesson. And also just let me know if you think there's, you know, if this is too complicated, we might take something like a Gothic element first, like last time it was just the Ionic column, just the capital to start with, you know, something we can draw in some detail before we go on to something major like this. But hopefully this gives you a linear set of progression from an Ionic column somewhere in ancient Greece to a theatre in ancient Rome, and then a Renaissance church that's still very relevant today.
I think this is an excellent idea, definitely something to develop further. So thank you very much all for joining us this evening, and we are looking forward to seeing your works. I will be sharing the link where you can post them, and yeah, really looking forward to those. And Philip, thank you very much for an engaging session once again. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you. So Happy New Year and see you all again.
Happy New Year all, and have a lovely evening. Bye-bye now. Bye.
Bye.